We read and hear a heck of a lot about censorship, particularly in recent times. Now, there are those out there in the community who say it's just a necessary step to ensure a just and fair society. They say it's all about equality, but they're wrong. Censorship has always been used by groups, by governments and individuals to limit freedom of thought and freedom of expression. Now, if you go back through history, the first notable case of censorship that I could dig up occurred in 399 BC, when Greek philosopher Socrates was executed because of his influence over Roman youth. They didn't like what he was saying, so they killed him. Now, history also details how censorship was embraced by regimes right across the cultural divide. The Chinese, the Egyptians, the Turks, the Spanish, they all engaged in book burnings to counter ideas that they didn't approve of. And many people would know the German translation of the Bible was actually banned by the Pope in 1624. We've seen other bans, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. It's regularly run into censorship problems, being repeatedly turfed out of libraries. And even Darwin's Origin of the Species was banned from Cambridge's Trinity College. That was Darwin's own university college. Now, the reasons used to justify these actions are many, but it usually comes back to vesting power and control in a very small group of people. And that's why Braille books, for example, were banned in Paris in 1842. The director of the Paris School for the Blind didn't want students to be able to read books on their own. Now, that desire for unparalleled authority has manifested itself through political regimes right throughout history. The Bolsheviks, they censored all books that didn't support communism back in 1917, I should say. These included the Bible, the Quran, and even the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The Nazi regime, they were notorious censors and book burners. And that all began on May 10, 1933, when university students burned 25,000 books deemed un-German. And we look back at these historical moments and think, how could they do that? I mean, what evil was at work inside a person that saw words on a page and personal thought as such a threat? Well, I regret to say that unfortunately, that scourge has not been deleted from mankind. Today, we live in our own version of these book-burning, illiberal times. Of course, the battle isn't just over words on paper. It is much, much broader than that. You see, the political left cannot survive without censorship. Their ideas are so kooky, they're so flawed, they are so dangerous that they cannot withstand the scrutiny of open debate. And that's why they're always looking to shut opposing ideas down. Now, we've seen the modern day version of book burning. Various books have been banned in schools and libraries for failing the left's racial or sexual purity test, while they actively promote alternate sex and gender theories to very young children. See, in the left's world, it's wrong for kids to read Dr. Seuss, but it's actually okay for 4-year-olds to be read The Gender Fairy. During the COVID pandemic, remember that information that ran counter to the authorised messaging of government? It was dismissed publicly and privately as misinformation, and those who dared speak it were exiled to the fringes of society. And individuals who actively promoted ideas like the Wuhan lab leak or alternative COVID treatments were often cancelled or banned from public forums. That's censorship. And that censorship continues today. As little is made of how the information that was used to justify forcing all of us to be locked up or masked and segregated, it was actually misused, it was misrepresented, or it was just plain wrong. And more recently, during this federal election campaign, there have been calls for Liberal candidate Catherine Deves to be disendorsed over some historic social media posts. But Deves' central political issue, calling out the unfairness of biological men competing in women's sport, is absolutely right. And athletes and mums and dads and normal people around the country know it, but many are too afraid to speak up. Those that do are labelled transphobic by the likes of politician Ali Steggall, who herself is an Olympic bronze medalist, a commendable effort, but she never had to compete against biological men in her own sport and won't say whether she was willing to have done so. And even the New South Wales Deputy Liberal leader, Matt Keane, yes, he is a Liberal, yes, was falling over himself in a rush to condemn Deves that he actually resorted to misrepresenting her remarks in a radio interview with Ben Fordham on 2GB. Have a listen.
When you talk about likening young trans people to sex offenders, I don't think she did that. Can you show me where she did that?
Well, I mean, the quote here, I'm reading it, half of all transgender men are sex offenders.
She was talking about transgender men, and she was talking about the prison population.
Well, it's not appropriate language.
You've just verbaled her by suggesting, Matt, you've just verbaled Catherine Deeves live on the air by saying twice now that she was comparing trans children to sex offenders. And then when you clarify the quote, you're talking about men, and she was talking about men in the male prison population.
Very hard to believe what they say when they get caught out expressing such falsehoods. And I could go on. There are so many examples. We see censorship and cancel culture on social and legacy media. We see it in politics, in the workplace. In fact, we see it just about everywhere. And believe me, this societal trend isn't about maintaining peace and harmony or fairness, as some will tell you. It is about conditioning people to think in a single dimension. And that dimension is approved by those seeking to engineer society for their own ends. Just like every single book-burning period of the past, this one is about control. That's why so many feel they have to walk on eggshells, as the Prime Minister put it the other day. We're being forced to conduct our lives in fear of offending some professional complainant or another. And it's happening simply because the lefts, who have captured all the institutions, their ideas on economics, on gender, identity, politics, they cannot be sustained under serious scrutiny. Remember, they push racist policies under the guise of combating racism. They pretend that gender is just a social construct, but then insist there's gender inequality. They promote money printing as the means of making us all richer. And they think freedom, rather than a lack of personal responsibility, is actually the cause of societal ills. We are now in the grip of a delusional collective that is just as dangerous and evil as the intolerant book burners, I should say, of yesteryear. It's now up to all of us to take a stand and say we are not going to accept it anymore.